I'm Jane Secker, and this is the last and final episode of StoryCast 21. When we set out to make this series, we asked our journalists and producers to share with us the one story they worked on, which has stayed with them more than any other this century. The responses were many and varied, and we took from these ideas to bring you a selection of personal stories from just some of this century's biggest news events. But 21 years ago, as we readied ourselves for this new century, we found ourselves reporting on what was then expected to be the biggest story of our times. Something not unlike the COVID-19 pandemic of today, and that this story had the potential to impact everyone all across the world. The very first story of 2000 revolved around what was then a worldwide effort to combat a global computer bug. Episode 21 of StoryCast 21 tells one man's story from that crisis. This is the Y2K Prison Bug.
The so-called Year 2000 computer bug has generated fears that anything from nuclear missiles to interbank trading systems could fail when 1999 turns into the year 2000.
My name is Rob Mulhern and I'm the series producer of Sky News StoryCast. Back in December 1999, people were pretty nervous about the dawn of a new millennium. Experts had long been predicting that on the stroke of midnight, on the 1st of January 2000, the computers that managed not only our economies but our lives would fail.
The problem is systems thinking 00, the shorthand for 2000, is instead 1900. Organisations have spent months and years aiming to avoid this.
No one, it seemed, thought to program computers to recognise dates beyond the 31st of December 1999.
Often they thought it was 1980 or 1976, and sometimes those systems didn't handle that change very well at all and crashed.
This is Matthew Hackling. He's a cybersecurity consultant from Perth. And back in 1999, I myself was living in Australia, among the first major economies set to experience the Millennium date change.
Failing to guard against the problem is threatening to bring the country to a standstill, from telecommunications to banking.
I remember vividly the Australian government taking Y2K really seriously. How the collapse of computer systems may lead, get this, to the collapse of civilization itself. And as well as the threats to the economy, there were huge concerns around law and order. And one area in particular.
In an Australian prison, there's really not that many prison officers on the facility. They use technologies to detect people breaking in and people breaking out, and wouldn't really want the doors on the most secure facility to pop open on New Year's Eve.
Back in 1999, Matthew Hackling was handed one of the toughest jobs of the entire Y2K crisis. Fixing the computer bug that was set to throw into chaos the Australian prison system, thereby handing inmates a possible escape. The countdown was on. You might expect the solution to a future national computer crisis to begin in an IT lab somewhere. But the road to solving this programming problem actually started in the quiet suburban bedroom of Matthew's home in Perth, Western Australia.
I was very much into computers from a young age. Both my parents are academics, and so I grew up on university networks. My mother was a mainframe operator for the University of Western Australia. I used to play online games with uni students when I was, knee-high.
Despite the fact that Matthew was still just a kid in the 1980s, he quickly went from playing games to making them.
When I was a kid, one of the first programs that I programmed was coded in from a magazine, and it was like a little game where you flew a spaceship down like a ravine and didn't crash into the walls. And I was pretty impressed with myself when I got that to work.
Matthew's love of computers, it stayed with him through his teenage years. By 1997, he had a university degree in IT and security management. And by 1999, when computers pretty much ran everything in the world, Matthew had found himself in a specialist role with the Ministry of Justice. His job, securing Australia's toughest prisons. As well as the countless economic issues thrown up by the Millennium Bug. And in terms of this story, the government of Western Australia were now in a race against time to try and make their jails Y2K compliant.
So the worst case scenario for a maximum security prison would be, of course, like somebody breaking in to break out prisoners when things went a little bit haywire, or a prisoner's organising a prison break.
It was now 9 months to go to the date change. Matthew's first major assignment actually turned out to be the state's toughest jail, Casuarina Prison, located on the outskirts of Perth and the scene of a Christmas Day prison riot only months before.
The one that always sticks in my mind is Casuarina Prison, because that's probably the premier maximum security prison in Western Australia. But it is kind of like in a kind of arid, dusty, sandy area, and it has very high razor wire fences. There is, armed response vehicles that patrol the perimeter of the prison, and the perimeter of the prison does not have a break in it. The gatehouse is actually underneath the razor wire, and that's designed for maximum security. And I tell you what, it's pretty spooky going into that facility the first time, especially when you do this long, long walk from the gatehouse to the centre of the prison. All you hear is the whistle of the wind through the razor wire, and it's very eerie feeling.
Because Casuarina Prison was home to some of Australia's most dangerous criminals, security depended as much on the 24-hour surveillance cameras as the prison guards. In simple terms, this technology was controlled by a network of clocks and timers that opened and shut cell doors, that turned on and off cameras.
So all those sort of systems, be they closed circuit television or perimeter detection systems or access control systems, intrusion detection, they all work on computer systems and embedded systems.
If it came to pass that these clocks stopped working when the date changed from 1999 to 2000, well, this may inadvertently hand thousands of prisoners the chance of an escape.
In any maximum security prison where people are getting locked up for multiple decades for doing really bad type stuff, they're always looking for a way to get out. So.
But if the security problem in Casuarina were to be dealt with properly, then Matthew and his fellow team of engineers would themselves need to be locked inside.
We had as-built drawings that showed where all the field equipment was throughout the prison, but we really didn't know whether there were clocks in them or not.
Only then could they set off in search of the clocks and timers that needed to be fixed so as to prevent against jailbreaks.
When I was in the prison, a lot of the technologies, they're hidden away from the inmates, in roof spaces or in equipment cabinets. So there was a lot of getting into places, dusty places that people hadn't been to for a while, that they didn't have a clock in them. You did end up crawling through a lot of roof spaces because that's where we put a lot of the security technologies. And so it was really an activity of writing down serial numbers and model numbers of devices and forming inventory. And what we did is, if it had a clock in it, then we tested it.
The difficulty is, even though all this work has been done on the Millennium Bug, it remains in many areas an issue of public confidence.
Weeks quickly turned into months, and as Matthew set about his work in Casuarina, and the other maximum security prisons in Western Australia. Beyond the prison walls, public anxiety around the Y2K crisis continued to ramp up.
Airlines show 13% at some risk.
Remarkable as it might sound, planes falling from the sky and bank accounts being wiped of their balances were among the chief concerns, both domestically and internationally.
8 major financial institutions also face severe risk.
But if Y2K was starting to feel like a bad science fiction movie, then Matthew, who by now believed he'd tracked down nearly all the prison security systems, was finding that work on the ground in one of the assigned maximum security prisons was anything but.
Yeah, we actually had some issues with a cell intercom system, and these systems are in cells so that prisoners can press a button and talk to a guard in the gatehouse. When we rolled the system over to 2000, at this prison, all the cell intercom systems went off. The system clocked over to 1980.
It was for this very situation that the Ministry of Justice hired Matthew. A situation where prison guards, outnumbered by prisoners, may well find themselves cut off and unable to communicate, not just with inmates, but more critically each other. A nightmare scenario, however remote. Already, it was apparent to lots of prisoners, and some with no hope of ever being released, that the Y2K bug could well compromise security in their individual prison.
And that was unexpected. And what we ended up doing is we ended up upgrading that system to newer firmware on the field equipment so that it would work properly after the Y2K turnover.
Against this backdrop, well, it wouldn't be entirely accurate to say the Ministry of Justice had complete faith in the security upgrade work.
In a maximum security prison, there are people who are armed on site. The MOJ did have a lot of sort of contingency planning, and they did sort of run, a crisis management type activity. And, I suspect they might have put a few extra people on for the Y2K shift. No one was just sort of crossing their fingers and, hoping that everything would work out all right.
By now, spring had given way to summer in Australia, and little by little, prison wing by prison wing, Matthew and his colleagues had completed the upgrade work in not only Casuarina, but Western Australia's other maximum security prisons.
There's also growing concern that systems would experience computer breakdowns in the year 2000.
By now, dramatic Y2K news reports from across the world were impossible to avoid.
Across the world, billions of pounds have been spent on making computers Y2K compliant, perhaps none's more important than the computers that run the nuclear bunkers of Russia and America. And the Rocky Mountains...
Waking up on New Year's Eve against the backdrop of reports like that one, citing possible nuclear Armageddon, Matthew took comfort in the fact that he'd found every clock, he'd fixed every timer. At least he hoped so.
I had a bit of professional sort of, curiosity. It's like, did we really get everything? Or, if we didn't get everything, it couldn't be a system that was, critical.
Either way, the Ministry of Justice was now mere minutes and thousands of alert prisoners away from the final countdown of the millennium.
And my wife was actually drumming in a samba band. I joined her marching through the streets of Perth to a party on top of a building in, I think it was Subiaco.
Julie, I know a lot of people were watching Australia, the first sign of any possible trouble.
So I wasn't too concerned, but I tell you, I did get some extra cash out of the ATM, just in case the ATMs all shut down for a couple of days after Y2K. And I made sure I wasn't in a plane, and I made sure I wasn't on the road.
Ultimately, though, At around 1 minute past 12 on New Year's Day 2000, the cell doors inside Western Australia's maximum security prisons remained firmly closed.
It was on my mind until we finished and started cracked open the first beer. But I was happy to, not be around a lot of technology and not be responsible for a lot of technology. We ended up finishing up at a party on the top of a parking garage, I believe.
In the minutes and hours that followed, news bulletins carried no reports of planes falling from the sky. Large computer networks continued to function, and while there were plenty of lost bank cards, no one lost a bank account or saw their bank balance wiped. Whether this is entirely down to the estimated $500 billion spent worldwide on making systems Y2K compliant is, well, something that's still open to debate.
I can't recall any really major incidents. I'm sure if we looked on Wikipedia we might find some. Yeah, so I look fondly back on those times, and I'm really thankful to the people that gave me the opportunity to work there at the engineering company.
The Y2K Prison Bug was written and produced by Rob Mulhern, with recordings from Tom Gillespie. Special thanks to Matthew Hackling and all our contributors over the last 21 episodes. For more information on this episode, and all of the other 20, of course, go to skynews.com/StoryCast21. Finally, thanks to everyone who made this series, which was written, produced and sound mixed by Rob Mulhern. Research, recordings and digital by Tom Gillespie. Archive was Simon Windsor. The TV treatments, Victoria Hudson-Grant and Emily Deaker. The story consultant, Dave Terrace. The design and graphics, Brian Gillingham. And for social media, Chris Scott and Sam Gould. If you enjoyed the series or just one particular episode, please share, comment or rate on the platform of your podcast provider. StoryCast will return again in 2022. I'm Jane Secker. Thank you for listening.
Happy New Year, Australia. Welcome to the 21st century on this magnificent night, the Millennium Night, eternity over Sydney Harbour. Fantastic scenes.